Welcome to the Balsam Blind Podcast. I'm Virginia.
And I'm Virginia. As we've gone through life, we've learned something important.
That Tyler doesn't know his name.
I read the words on the page.
Nobody knows we're reading off the page.
They do now.
Well, stop telling them. We're
What?
supposed to have this memorized.
No, we're good. Keep going.
Life is messy.
Yeah, just
Okay.
like this intro.
Yeah, and there's a lot of armchair experts out there who will try to tell you how to make life simple.
It's not. That's why I don't remember this and I read it off a page. So you're not going to find any armchair experts here. Instead, you're going to find everyday people who've jumped into the mess of life and are making an adventure of it.
Yep. I kind of like how we didn't know who was going to start and I beat you to it.
You did. You did. I was going to go with Let's Go really dramatically.
I'm so glad you didn't.
Why? But I could have.
Okay, so let's play a game. It's called This or That.
This or that.
And, you know, like on Instagram when people do stories and you post, like, your choices for this or that, and then you post the blank this or that frame so that people can then post their choices on this or that.
Uh-huh.
That's what this is.
Uh-huh.
Okay?
Got it.
Alright. I stole it from somebody, but,
No, that's what you do. You literally just explained that. That's what you're supposed to do with this or that. So it's not theft.
yeah. Alright, so this or that. Christmas Eve or Christmas Day?
Oh, Christmas Day.
Why?
I genuinely don't have a preference between the two.
Alright, giving gifts or getting gifts?
I like to pick out a good, thoughtful gift, but I really like to get a gift.
I know, I think everybody really likes to get gifts, but there are those few people out there that love to give gifts.
I don't know if I love to give a gift. I like to pick out a thoughtful gift. I think there's a difference.
Yeah, there is. I mean, sort of. Because the people who love it are probably being thoughtful with every gift that they give.
Sure.
Alright, stockings or presents?
Presents. Because the stockings are, sometimes there's good stuff in there, sometimes there's not.
Eggnog or apple cider?
Neither.
Yeah, I was actually going to change that to hot cocoa or coffee.
Hot chocolate, because coffee's gross.
Yeah. Colored lights or white lights?
Good question, solid question. Depends on what it's on, if it's a tree, how you've chosen to decorate it. There's a lot of factors. It's really about what looks good in the environment that you're in.
Sure. So how about our environment?
What do you mean by our environment?
Colored lights or white lights?
On what?
In our house.
Well, we have both, and it varies.
We basically have mostly colored.
Yeah, that's true.
Color's my favorite. Okay. Roasted chestnuts or candied pecans?
I don't know if I've had roasted chestnuts, to be honest.
What about like holiday, what do they call it? White trash or
Well, that's like
candied pecans?
Yeah, that's got like chocolate and stuff.
It's got like
so
Chex
I'm gonna go that way.
Okay. I love candied pecans. I've never had chestnuts though. Alright, homemade decor or store-bought decor?
Store-bought, all the way.
I like homemade.
Yeah.
It can be store-bought, but I like for it to look homemade. But I like homemade. Like, I love our little tree that has homemade ornaments on it. Or, I guess not all of them are homemade, but,
Some of them are.
I like that look.
Yeah.
So even if it's store-bought, I like the homemade look.
Sure, makes sense.
I like Christmas Day. An answer. I really don't like either with the gifts because it stresses me out.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I enjoy getting a gift. It is really fun to get a gift, but there's always like this stress behind it of like, did I get them a gift? Did I get them a gift as good as I feel like my gift is? And then that's where the whole giving gifts stresses me out too.
Right.
Ooh, stressful.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I love the stockings. JoJo does an amazing stocking stash. And it's my favorite. I love the gifts, but like opening the stocking is my favorite.
Yes.
I like coffee and hot cocoa. Never had eggnog. Apple cider's alright. Color lights, definitely, and I answered the rest of them. So, that's my choices.
Okay. Nice.
This or that.
Cool. Well, what are we up to on the podcast?
Well, today we are continuing with our series, and we are on the, what is it, like the second part of the middle of the, we're in the middle of this here, and...
And this here being the partial kingdom?
The partial kingdom.
Yes, that's the one.
It's like 2.1.
No, it's just 2. It's 2 of 4.
Okay, whatever.
Yeah, just go with 2 or 4
of the partial kingdom, which is of the whole Bible story, God's big picture.
Right.
So we're in the partial kingdom. Last week we talked about God's people, which are the
Israelites. The Israelites are God's people.
They are chosen.
Yes.
By God.
Absolutely.
And they descended from?
Of Abraham.
Yes.
Yes. He's the father of a nation.
The Israelites.
The Israelites, yes.
Those are God's people. I'm just making sure we're clear there.
Yes. Nailed it. So we're going to keep going with the partial kingdom today. So there's 4 parts to it. So first it was God's people.
That's what we talked about last week.
Yep. Then today we're going to talk about God's rule and God's blessing. And the last 2 parts is God's place and God's king. Couldn't get place out of my head there for a second. Took me a moment. But yes, God's place and king will be the last 2 parts. But today we're talking God's rule and God's blessing. And so there's a promise that's kind of wrapped up in all of that, and you can find it in Genesis 12. It's God talking to Abraham. It's talking about, I will bless you, and through you, I'm even going to bless all of the nations. And so there's this promise of blessing to God's people. Now, in the Bible, to be under God's rule means that you're able to enjoy His blessing. Think back to the garden, for instance. What is the blessing of God in the garden? What's the big one? I mean, you can name a ton, but what's kind of that big thing that's easy to focus in on?
They got to be with God, in the presence of God.
Yeah, why do you think that's such a blessing?
Well, because of who God is. He's our creator, almighty God, wonderful, amazing, awesome, not even enough words to describe Him. But yeah, just being in His presence is probably the best thing ever. Yeah,
I can get on board with that. So yeah, being under God's rule means being able to enjoy His blessing. His rules, they're wisdom for life. There's a lot of just common sense, but sometimes there's even some deep wisdom underneath all of what He's talking about. And inside of all of His rule, or when we're following His rule, I guess is what I really mean. When we disobey His rules, that means we can't be in His presence. We don't get to enjoy that blessing of His presence because God's not going to be with people who are disobeying Him. He literally can't because of His holiness. It would just take us out when we're in our sinfulness.
Yeah, it's like you got to think about who God is, first of all, and how holy He is. How He can't be in the presence of sin. And so when His rule is disobeyed, then it's not like He's just mad because you disobeyed. It's literally like you can't enjoy His presence because you're not under His rule. You stepped out from under His rule. It's kind of a different way to think about it. Like it's not just, a reprimanding king. He's like wanting to be He wants us to be in His presence.
Yeah. Yeah, and so for this nation of Israel, they've got to come underneath God's rule in order to enjoy the blessing of His presence. And so that's what we're going to look at is all of that. But before we dive too deep into the rule and the blessing, I want to kind of catch us up on the story because we left off with the people of Israel had gone through the Red Sea. And so after that, they're journeying towards Mount Sinai, which was the place they were going to go and worship God. That's what they kept asking Pharaoh to be let to do, was go and do that. And so they're headed there now. So they get there. God tells Moses, he said, hey, let all the people know that I'm going to speak to you and them from the mountain, and so they got to get themselves ready. And so they go through some ritual purification and things like that to get themselves ready to see/hear from God, and by see, I mean they'll see a representation of. So God shows up. He shows up in a cloud, and there's thunder, and there's lightning, and it's apparently pretty crazy and scary, because when he speaks and the people hear him, they look at Moses and they're like, all right, from this point forward, you could probably just talk to God for us, because that was real scary. And Moses is like, yeah, sure, no problem. So he goes up the mountain. He gets up there. He hears some laws, some agreements from God to the people. He comes back down, shares it with the people, and kind of looks at them and is like, hey, basically, we follow him. He's going to be our God. That's kind of what he says. And so he writes it all down. Next day, he goes up again. And this time, he stays up there for a while. He actually stays up on top of the mountain for 40 days. And that just feels like a long time, I gotta be honest. Like, there's a part of it's like, it's just over a month, but at the same time, like, 40 days is a long time. Think about how quickly, in just a matter of days, our world changed in the middle of a global pandemic. It went from everything is normal till less than 2 weeks, and just everything had shut down, and everything had changed. So 40 days is a long time. While he's up there, he gets some more laws that God has kind of communicated to him. And God even takes and writes on 2 stone tablets the 10 Commandments. Now, Moses gets towards the end, or really to day 40, and God goes, hey, guess what? I'm going to send you back down there, and the people who agreed to follow me, just 40 days ago, and they saw all the cool things I did in Egypt, Moses is like, yeah, the Israelites, obviously. It's like, yeah. Well, they've done a thing. Tell us about the thing they did, Virginia.
Well, they were getting all antsy about Moses being gone, and they... I laugh at it every time. They asked Aaron, who is Moses' brother, to build them 2, or they together built, as a whole, just built 2 golden calves. 1 golden calf, where they bowed down and worshipped a thing that they had created out of gold.
Yeah, and my favorite part of it, alright, is when Moses gets down there and he's like, what the heck did you do, Aaron? Aaron's like, I collected up all their gold earrings because they were pressing me, and they're like, we need a representation of our God, and so I took all the gold earrings, I threw it in the fire, and boop, out came the golden calf.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
And it's just so wild. He's like, it just came out. It was just a golden calf. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, like it was like a golden calf literally was formed by accident.
Yep. Yeah, it's good stuff. And there's also a Hebrew joke in there. So it's called a golden calf. So Baal, you'll hear a lot about Baal in Old Testament as you read about him. He's a pagan god. Baal is represented by a strong bull. And so this is actually a joke of going, hey, they tried to make a bull, but it's just this little calf compared to God. And so there's a little bit of a joke in there that just doesn't translate to English that I always find funny.
That is hilarious. And so you think, like, really, guys? Like, what? 40 days was not that long, first of all. Second of all, like, why did you think that creating a calf would be the right thing to do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in their defense, they had been in Egypt for 400 years as a people. Many of them probably didn't know anything about this God who refers to himself as I am until Moses showed up on the scene. Like, they've probably been worshiping the same gods as the Egyptians, and all the Egyptians, they worship gods through these idol representations of the gods. And so that's kind of what they're doing here. They weren't necessarily looking to go, hey, we're going to worship this other god besides the one that brought us out of Egypt. They're probably going, hey, we want a representation of him the same way we would have done back in Egypt.
Yeah.
They also haven't gotten the 10 Commandments at this moment, and so to the best of my knowledge, they haven't been told, don't make an image of me, kind of thing. So there's some level of forgivability in there. But I also love the end of the story. Moses he grinds up this golden calf. I don't know how big it is, but he grinds this thing into dust. He pours it in the water, and he makes the people drink it. Which just feels, it's a little harsh, but it's also hilarious. He's like, here, you guys want it? It'll be inside of you. At least until you pee it out. Alright, and in that process, Moses was really angry, and so he actually broke the 10 Commandments. So he has to go back up to get a new set of 10 Commandments. God tells him to bring up 2 new tablets, and he'll write them again. And so he goes up there, and he gets probably more than he bargained for, thinking he was going to get the 10 Commandments and come back down. He spends another 40 days up on top of the mountain. He gets some more law. There's actually this moment where he has to see God. God's like, nah, you can't see me. It would literally kill you. But you can get in this cave. I will cover you up with my hand, and I'll pass by, and you can, look at my back or something. And so he
But just still, it's not... I don't know, is it God,
yeah, that's...
I just don't understand.
Yep, I don't know. It's wild. He's got a hand, and he's apparently got a back that you can see, at least in this moment.
There's something you can see.
He chose to have a visible representation.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah, so he got some more law. God passes by, gets a new set of the 10 Commandments, and he comes down after this 40 days, and the people freak out when Moses comes down off the mountain, because he has been in the presence of God, and he is now glowing. He's radiating from God. And I don't know what that looks like, but I just like to imagine he's really shiny and hard to look at. It's kind of like looking directly at a light bulb. Mm-hmm. You never want to do that, but for some reason, if you stand over the lamp and you turn it on, you look at it. You just always do, or at least I do. I look directly at the bulb almost every time. I know it's going to go wrong, but I do it anyway. Well, the people are freaking out about Moses, so they actually made him wear a veil until it faded away for a long time.
They're yeah, cover that up.
Yeah, it's craziness. And so they spend the rest of a year, because they spend a year total hanging out by Mount Sinai. They spend the rest of the year building the tabernacle, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute. But let's talk about the law, or the rule that is given. So when you think about Old Testament law, is it just work-based salvation?
It feels like it is, because you have to, I guess because you have to follow the rule, and if you don't, then you have to do a sacrifice, or, there's a ritual to purify yourself.
Yeah.
So it seems like it is. Mm. But in this situation, God chose the people before he gave the rule, and so that's just kind of showing his grace. Mm-hmm. That they were chosen by his grace, not by anything that they did.
Yeah, I mean, Jacob was probably a decent representation of this. He's chosen in Rebekah's womb to be the next leader of the people in the family line that's eventually going to be Israel. He was chosen in the womb well before he could do anything right or wrong. He was chosen, right. And God has chosen this people. It's Exodus 20 talks about, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the place of slavery. And it's just that reminder, it's he is talking in that moment, I am your God, before he ever gives a single law to Moses.
Yeah.
So it's not an attempt to earn salvation, but instead, following the law is a response to the salvation he has already given. Right.
And then also, to be in the presence of him.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you nailed it. So that's part of what the law is for. And so the law is to enable us to be able to enjoy God's presence. Because that's what happens to Adam and Eve, is they disobey, and so they're no longer able to enjoy God's presence.
So, just breaking it down, from the very beginning when Adam and Eve stepped out from under God's rule, then they lost the blessing of being in God's presence. Mm-hmm. And so God knew it was going to happen, but then after that moment is when he, initiated the plan, executed the plan, to bring us back into his blessing, into his presence.
Yes.
And so that's where we are. We're going through this timeline of okay, Adam and Eve. Now we're at the Israelites. Well, they were chosen to bless all nations. So it's coming back around to like the Israelites are my chosen ones, but I'm using them. I'm choosing them by my grace, and I'm using them to be able to bless everyone, so everyone can again make the choice to be in my presence and be under my rule.
So think about it like this. When do you feel closest to God? And not necessarily like in a moment of worship, but I mean like a season of life that you have felt closest to God. I'd argue it is when you are living under His rule. It's when you're living as a believer should live that you start to feel closest to God. It's those moments where you start hearing Him in those subtle nods and little things, however you want to define hearing God.
Or you read the Bible every day and you're like, oh, that applies to my life, that applies to my life, that applies to my life. Wow, it's like, God, you know what I needed today.
Yep. Yeah, and so we feel closest to God, and we understand, we recognize His presence when we're living in His rule. And so one of the things the law is for is to give us the enjoyment of His blessing. Another thing it does is help us realize our sin. It's classic Romans 3:20. It's no one will be justified in his sight by the works of the law. Rather, it's the knowledge of sin that comes through the law.
Right. So, like, the law is important because otherwise we would just think that we're fine. Like, that we don't have any, like, you know, that we're not sinners.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you don't know rules, you can't follow them. That's why I said just a minute ago, like, I give the Israelites a half pass, not a full pass, but a half pass in the whole golden calf incidents, because they hadn't heard, as best I recall, at that moment, they hadn't heard they weren't supposed to build some representation of God. They didn't understand that, and so they didn't know.
Right, and like you said, for 400 years they've been influenced by
all these other things.
Religions.
Yeah, absolutely. But now they know. Now they know, and so now they are they're going to be held to that standard.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also a realization of our need for a Savior. I think one of the things the law very clearly does is show that we can't do it. One of my favorite laws has to do with the fact that you can't wear clothes with two different fabrics. I don't know why that's in there. I legit don't understand it. I've never tried to take time to study it, but that's just one of those little bitty things. It's like, gosh, I will not pull that off, guaranteed. I'm gonna wear some clothes with two different fabrics. What is it? Galatians 3 that talks about we were confined under the law. We were imprisoned until the coming faith was revealed. The law was put in charge to lead us to Christ. We're under the law to recognize the fact that we can't do this on our own. And the law is also there to help us recognize God's standards. You know, it gives us the wisdom to know how to live. Some laws, they're very literal, like don't make an image of God. That's just very literal. But there's also principles in that. Mm-hmm. There's don't worship something that isn't me. Don't worship something that isn't God. And so, yeah, in our modern society, we don't struggle a lot with making an idol of God in the very literal sense, but I can easily make an idol out of my job. I can make an idol out of my wife or my kid or my favorite hobby or whatever. And so the principle, even in the very literal law, teaches us how to live. Israel themselves are meant to be God's holy nation. The whole reason they're chosen isn't because they're special, but they're chosen to show everyone who God is and how you're meant to live. Now, do they do a great job of that? Overall, not super. But I suspect there were some individuals who probably did rock at that. It's there to show us God's standards. And, you know, the whole story with the guy who comes to Jesus and asks him, hey, how do you sum up the law? How does he sum it up?
Love God, love people.
Love God and love people. Man, you summed it up even further.
Sorry, yeah, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself.
So how do you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind? What does that mean?
A daily effort and pursuit.
Mm.
Yeah, every day.
I like that.
It's an effort. It's just like we could sit back and, be lazy, not take a bath, and wash our hair and brush our teeth and feed ourselves well. But if we don't do those things, if we don't make the effort to do those things, then we'll be gross. So, like, in a similar sense, like, it's not just like you say, oh, I want to believe and love God, and it just happens. And something I've learned over the years of learning more about God, the more I learn about Him through reading His Word, specifically reading His Word. There's literally no other, like, almost really perfect way to get to know God. Like, that's the best way, reading His Word.
Yep.
The more I learn about God, the more I love Him.
Mm.
That's just interesting. It reminds me of a time a student in, I think she was 6th grade at the time, maybe 7th grade, but she was like, I believe in God, but how do I know if I love Him?
Solid question.
And I was like, at the time I was like, I don't answer this question. But I kind of just told her, I don't remember what I told her, but it was basically just like you have to come to know Him. Because how do you love somebody you don't know? And how do you love somebody you don't spend time with?
Right.
And then through that love, obviously, you have for God, the love for your neighbor, the love for others will, I'm not going to say it's going to come easily, but it will be a standard that you would live up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So that's God's law or God's rule. Obviously, we could have spent forever dealing with this, and I know there are plenty of people who go, oh man, Leviticus, that's the part where I always fall off whenever I try to do a Bible reading, or, if I want to fall asleep at night, I just go read Leviticus. And I get it, like, I've been there, but man, when I started reading Leviticus in light of Jesus and just really paying attention and started using some commentaries to help me understand some of the ways that would point to Jesus, it might be one of my more favorite books in the Bible now, just because of all the ways it foreshadows who Jesus is.
Right, and you and I talked about this a little while back, but when I read Leviticus this year, I fell in love with it.
Yeah.
And it is probably one of my favorite books. And similar to you, but I would word it a little bit different for the reason why I love it. Because it showed me who God is. Which is the same as learning about, foreshadowing Jesus. It's really the same thing. But it just taught me so much more about my God. And in the littlest details of those laws that don't make sense, I saw a God who cared for me as a person, and cared for the vulnerable, and cared for the forgotten, and cared for the unseen, and the discriminated against, and the marginalized. Like, He cared, and He loves His people that He created. I just learned so much about Him through reading Leviticus.
Yeah, no, that's huge.
And we hadn't said this yet. There was a quote that our pastor Bryant said this past week that just it kind of summed up things that we've all said before on this podcast, but just like speaking specifically about the law and who God is and how we take approach to what sin is in our life. This quote was really meaningful. He said, "If we don't understand the holiness of God, we will take a casual approach to sin." So if you ever catch yourself taking a casual approach to sin, then have you really recognized who God is and how holy He is?
Yep. No, that'll preach. That'll preach. I love it. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to hop into the blessing. Cool. So we just talked about God's rule. Now we want to talk about God's blessing. And the blessing we're specifically referring to is God's presence. Yep. And so the purpose of redemption, the whole reason God redeems is so that He can have a relationship with us. And I think it's easy to hear that, oh, God can't he won't be in a relationship with anybody who doesn't follow him. Like, you could start, or follow his rule. You'd almost think of him like a little kid who's like, no, you didn't play the game right. We're not playing anymore. And flips, Monopoly over, because no kid has ever finished a game of Monopoly in their life. It gets too crazy. But yeah, so you can start to think of God that way, but that's not the case. We just talked about how the Israelites, when God showed up in a cloud and spoke, and there's thunder and lightning, and they were afraid of that. That wasn't even fully God. Like, that is just God sending, like, a portion of who he is. The thing is, God literally cannot be with sin because of his holiness. His holiness would literally kill you as a sinner, and that's when he shows up in his fullness. When he is 100% fully there, sin can't be. And so that's the whole reason that God has to go through this whole redemption story that is the Bible, is because he wants to be fully there with you and with me. But he knows if he shows up fully and we're sinful, we're done.
That's actually, again, it's just like his grace.
Yeah.
Because he could just show up and be like,
you're done, and you're done, and you're done, and you're done. The exact opposite of Oprah.
Right.
But instead, he shows up in very small ways over time in order to enable him to, when the story eventually gets to the end of Revelation, be with us in his fullness. So he does that for the Israelite people through the tabernacle. So a large...
Explain what the tabernacle is.
Yes, 100%. So a large portion of Moses' and God's interactions on the top of Mount Sinai is actually instructions on the tabernacle, what it's going to look like, what its function is, all of the instruments and things that are going to be used inside of the tabernacle. Yeah, so it's twofold. So there's kind of a wall around it, and think like a canvas wall.
Okay.
So there's a wall that forms a courtyard. And
I'm just curious how they made this. They were in the wilderness.
Yeah, I don't know what they made it all out of. It's in Leviticus and Exodus and all that. They probably had to do... one, they got a lot of stuff from the Egyptians when they left Egypt. People were literally just throwing things at them, hoping they will leave, because when they leave, the plague should hopefully stop. Yeah. But two, they also do interact with people. You don't see it a lot, but they interact with people, and so there is trading, and they'll go, so stuff like that. But yeah, so there's a big canvas wall that means there's only one entrance in there, and then that forms a courtyard, and then in the courtyard there's a tent. Alright, so let's talk about the tent. So the tent has two main sections. In there is the holy place. And you're like, heck yeah, holy place, God. Sure, but actually there's the most holy place. That just feels like a kid naming kind of thing. It's like, yeah, this is the holy place, and then once everybody gets in here, this is just a holy place. I'm going to go to the most holy place over here. Y'all stay here. Man, I know, that was terrible. I don't know. It's what came to my mind. I was talking about kids a minute ago and their rules, so kids. Anyway, holy place, maybe you've heard of it as the Holy of Holies. So let's talk about the holy place. In the holy place, there's three main things: tools, instruments, furniture, whatever you want to call it. There's a table, and you're like, okay, cool, thanks for telling me there's a table. It's an important table. It holds the bread of the presence. Alright, and so the bread of the presence, it's 12 loaves of bread. It's fresh every day. Why is there 12, Virginia?
For the 12 tribes of Israel.
Nailed it, good job. The 12 tribes of Israel, so there's 12 loaves fresh every day, and they're a reminder that God is going to provide for all of their needs. And I love this because at this point, God hasn't provided the manna yet. He hasn't sent the quail that is both a blessing and a curse. He hasn't made water come from a rock. He hasn't done... I think he made poison water not poisonous one time. He hasn't done all of those crazy, awesome provision things yet, but he's pointing to it, and then later they're going to be a reminder of those things, this bread of the presence.
It's like, not reminiscent, but I guess
some
foreshadowing.
foreshadowing, and then later some reminiscing.
But I was going to say foreshadowing of the feeding the 5,000.
Oh, yes, 100%. I love that.
So the feeding the 5,000 was reminiscent of the 12 loaves of bread in the Holies of Holies.
100%.
I mean the holy place. The holy place.
Yeah, the holy place. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I like that. That's good.
I don't know, 12 loaves of bread, and then they're left over with 12 baskets.
Yeah, no, that's
for the 12 disciples.
Good catch, babe. I like that.
Jesus ate. Yeah, I guess he was human.
Yeah, he ate 100%. Because he talks about being hungry.
You're sorry, no, that was dumb.
Yeah.
He's human. He's human too.
He is. So the golden lampstand, there's a lampstand in there. We call them menorahs. They got the little shapes. They're kind of reminiscent of trees. Where was trees really important?
Trees are important a lot, but especially in
the
Garden of Eden.
It's a tree of life.
The tree of life.
That's right. And this lampstand is a reminder that He's constantly watching over them to keep them from harm, because what does a lamp do, specifically at night? It enables you to see.
Right, brings you light.
Yep. And then there's the altar of incense. It's where they constantly are burning incense, and it's to give you this sense of the nearness of God. It's like the haze machine, that you got in worship. You got the haze kind of going in the room, and you just feel a little bit more worshipful.
More in the presence of God.
Yes, that's right. That's for you, Josh Jordan, by the way.
Gonna say it's like using lavender oil to help your nerves and your stress calm.
That's true. That is very true. Scents,
more realistic.
Scents really do help in that realm to some degree, and so this is just kind of one of those ways to kind of give you a sense that there's something different, because you're in, I don't know how many people there were, but it was just a boatload of people that make up the nation of Israel, and they're living in a desert. They're not bathing. They're pooping where they live. There's animals. It stinks, man. But in the holy place,
smells like God.
It smells better in here, and that's just a good sense of the nearness of God.
It smelled like rosemary and lemon.
I like it. Rosemary and lemon. All right. We'll diffuse that one later. All right. So between the holy place and the most holy place, there's this curtain, or you may know it as a veil. What does a veil do? It kind of screens something, doesn't it? Yeah. And this veil is screening the entrance to the most holy place.
And I know we don't know off the top of our heads, but this veil was thick.
Yeah, I've heard that before, and then I've heard some conversation that it's maybe not quite as thick.
Well, just reading how they made it, I don't remember the exact dimensions or anything, but when
it's pretty thick.
It's thick. Yeah, it's not just like a see-through veil.
Right.
It's like a big thick curtain.
Right. Yeah. No, I almost have gotten the sense before, and I don't remember where I read or saw this, but it may potentially be multiple curtains kind of sewed together to make it.
You got that from Jerry Lewis, because I'm pretty sure that's where I'm getting my memory from.
I don't know.
When he talked about that, when we were youth students.
That's very possible. Very possible. But yeah, it's supposed to kind of block the entrance to the most holy place, because you can only go in there once a year, and there's a lot of process that goes through this. So the most holy place, in there is this one very specific thing. Indiana Jones looked for it. Some Nazis found it and opened it, and it didn't go well for them. It is the Ark of the Covenant. You're looking at me all a little confused.
I didn't know about the Nazis. Is that a real thing?
No, it's the Ark of the Covenant. It's from Indiana Jones.
I didn't know if you were still talking about the movie.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that melts their face off. They turn to skeletons.
Oh, yeah.
It's good times. It's been a long time since I watched it, but I remember that moment. The Ark of the Covenant, man. It's in there. The Ark of the Covenant is a clear, very clear representation of God's presence. It's this very holy object. It's a chest that contains the tablets that God inscribed the Ten Commandments on, and later it's also going to have Aaron's staff in there, or was it Moses? I think it's Aaron's staff in there, and it has actually budded and tried to grow some tree or some fruit or something. There's a whole story there. It'll also contain a jar of manna once the manna gets there, but those are future. At this moment, it just contains the 10 Commandments. Now, on top of there's a lid. Makes sense. It's a chest. Chest needs a lid. The lid is called the mercy seat, or the atonement cover. And on this lid, there are these two cherubs. What's a cherub?
It's a fat winged baby.
False. It is not a fat, weakened baby. It's an angel of sorts. It is definitely not a fat, winged baby.
No, it's just an angel.
The Renaissance, man. They painted and sculpted some really weird things. They just did. Anyway, it's an angel. It has wings, but it's not a fat baby. It probably doesn't look human all that much. But anyway, and their wings come together horizontally to form a seat. And this seat becomes the throne of the invisible God. This seat, the mercy seat, is the place where God meets with his people. And so once the tabernacle is built, once they get all the walls up, God's glory literally fills the most holy place, and he stays with his people there.
So God went to all this trouble of getting the Israelites out of Egypt, giving them some law and some rituals to follow for purification, all so that he could be in their presence.
Yep.
Or they could be in his presence.
Yes, absolutely. But that provides a problem for us.
It's not a perfect
solution. It's not a perfect solution because the Israelites still are sinful people just like everybody else.
Right.
They still mess up all the time. And so we run into that whole thing where God can't be in their presence. And so the options are God is in their presence and it kills them. God leaves their presence, or there's some kind of sacrifice. So a sacrificial system is set up to deal with this problem. So there are daily sacrifices. Every day people come, they bring a sacrifice because they're like, hey, I definitely accidentally made an idol yesterday. Just threw this gold in the fire. Now it popped an idol. Accident. At least that's what Aaron said. And so they'll say they'll confess their sin over the sacrifice, over the animal, and then the priest will take and sacrifice it. There's also an annual day of atonement. And on this day, there's a sacrifice for the people. There's 2 goats. The first is a sin offering. And after it's been sacrificed, this blood is taken by a priest who's gone through a ton of ritual preparedness to be able to go into the most holy place, and he sprinkles this sin offering on the ark. This is a substitution for all of Israel. And it's very clear that their life is brought through the death of something else, of another. Which is a really important theme somewhere in the Bible, but we'll get there. The second goat is a scapegoat, and this is literally where that phrase comes from. It's a scapegoat. The sins are confessed over this goat, and then they take and they drive it out into the wilderness because they are separated from those sins. See, the sacrifice is how they're atoned for. Mm-hmm. The sacrifice substitutes in this place, and it deals with sin. It atones for sin. It just drives sin all the way away. I think the coolest thing about the sacrificial system is it's not the Israelites who set this up. It's God.
Right.
He sets up this whole system because he knows that something is going to have to be done to deal with this problem of him being in their presence while they're still sinful. He is the one giving a way for sin to be dealt with. So God is present, but the people can't get very close. Like, just the high priest can only go into the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, once a year. That's not a very close relationship with God. Now, Moses is the exception to that. He does actually get to go in there a decent bit, but beyond, after Moses, that's just not the case. But even still, sacrifices, they enable some measurement of relationship with God, but it's just not that same ideal relationship that we see back in the garden where Adam and Eve are able to just walk around with God every day.
Right. They still weren't able to do that.
Yeah, they cannot be in that close relationship where they get the fullness of Him. And so that's why this is only a partial fulfillment of this kingdom promise of His presence. But all of this is a foreshadowing of Jesus. Mm. See, death Jesus' death deals with the sin fully once and for all. It's Hebrews 10 talks about it. It says,
It says, by this will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all time. Every priest stands day after day, ministering and offering the same sacrifices, time after time, which can never take away sins. But this man, after offering one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God.
Once for all. He didn't have to keep doing it over and over, man. We just said there were daily sacrifices, and then there was the annual sacrifice. And that priest, every single day, is making a sacrifice. Jesus steps up. He makes one sacrifice that is worth everything, and it's done. Sacrifice never needs to happen again. Not just for things that have happened in the past, but for things that have happened in the future. God is present beyond the veil. We talk about it anytime you hear the Easter story. More than likely, you probably hear something about this veil and the fact that it is ripped in two when Jesus dies. It's this very visual representation that the fullness of God no longer has to be contained in the most holy place, but it can be present in God's people. Not God's people as in a nation of people at Israel, but God's people as in people who have surrendered to following His rule and thus get to enjoy the fullness of His blessing. It's Hebrews 10 again, it's 19 and 20. It says we've got confidence now to enter the most holy place through the blood of Jesus. He has inaugurated, He's created a new way and a living way through the curtain. That's what Jesus does for us. You know, it's throughout the Bible that God saves people by providing the substitute to die in the place of others. Not the substitute is just here, but He provides the actual substitute. I mean, for a man, it's Abraham and Isaac's story. For families, it's the Passover. For a whole nation, the Day of Atonement. And for the world, there's Jesus. All of these different, very clear moments where God steps up and He provides the substitute.
And that's why in 1 Corinthians, Paul says that we are a holy temple for the Holy Spirit, a temple for the Holy Spirit. And it's because God is present in our temple, our tabernacle, as a follower of Jesus.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the word for God dwelled with us is literally that God tabernacles with us. It's this very visual representation that we become the most holy place. Not because we're holy in and of ourselves, but because the sacrifice of Jesus has been sprinkled on us, to go with Old Testament language. His sacrifice has been sprinkled on us to purify us and make us His most holy place. We best sense His presence when we submit to the wisdom of His rule, and we best reflect Him when we live out of the abundance of His presence in us. I think that's probably the big takeaways of God's rule and God's blessing.
All right, Tyler. Can we just stop right here and say why we think this is important for us to be doing this series?
Yes, 100%. I mean, there's a level of it for me that I've just enjoyed getting to dig into this, and that's been fun. There's a level of it that I like to teach, and this is a form of teaching, but I think the biggest part of it is hoping that someone, whether you know Jesus and are a follower of His or not, will hear this and come to fully or more fully appreciate who He is and what He's done on your behalf. I'm hoping that someone sees the Bible as more than a lot of rules and stuff and anger and death and then Jesus and love and stuff, but see it as a full redemption story of a God who recognized if he was in our presence when we were sinful, it would take us out. And so instead, he was willing to play the long game so that he could be fully present with us.
The long game, yeah.
Very long game.
Yeah, I think my answer to that question is just, I went a long time hearing the Bible, being taught the Bible, but not always fully understanding. And the book by Vaughn Roberts that we're, going through in this series, just this learning process, I think, is just helpful for me to learn more about God. But I think getting to talk it out is helpful for you as a listener to learn more about who God is and maybe understand the Bible a little bit more, like Tyler said, like what it's all actually about. And in that, you would come to know God more, closer to God, and then make him known.
Absolutely. Well, that is God's rule and God's blessing. Next week, we are going to dig into God's place. Yep. And so we will see you guys next week.
All right, so what you can do for us right now is to subscribe to the podcast so that you get episodes every Friday, and let people know about us. So just share it on social media with your friends. Bowls of Life, just let them know about it. We're here to teach and talk about this messy life. So let your friends know, and while you're doing all that, just make sure you leave us a nice 5.0 rating and a nice word review for all the kind words you have for us, maybe, hopefully. So rate us and review, and tell us what is messy in your life that you are loving by going to anchor.fm/bowlsoflife and doing a recording. We keep saying this, no one has recorded anything yet, but if you would please do that, we would feature you on an episode. That's something messy in your life, but you're loving it.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us on the journey.
Bye.